Welcome to Scale Stories. Everyone knows the world's most famous Corellian YT-1300 transport, the Millennium Falcon. I have this beautiful little Bandai kit, and today I'm going to build a story for it in just 35 square inches of galaxy. Something like this. I started this project like I start most of my projects, with a faint inspiration and absolutely no idea of what I was doing, with the diorama or the production quality. For both of our sake, I'm going to start out here, where I ended up with a proper battery pack, the shadow box already painted, with the nice bottle cap mount for the galactic hoopty, and a hole cut for the wires that would be out of sight in the end. I then took my time figuring out where the battery pack would fit so that the shadow box would still mount flush, be out of sight, allow access to its built-in switch, and also leave the battery cover accessible. This took some time, but I eventually got it where I wanted it, and would later superglue it in place. I filmed most of the assembly of the Millionaire Eagle on my 2K Potato, so I elected not to include that, but you probably know that Bandai doesn't mess around. This thing snapped together cleaner than most models I have to glue, but I glued it anyway. There was almost no sanding whatsoever. It was honestly kind of rude. One of my main concerns about this build was making sure that the LED light didn't bleed through the seams or gaps in the space fader. When I assembled it and tested the light, I also realized that the light could also be seen directly through the plastic, giving it this weird glowy look. It was not very cash money. After having myself a good think about it, I relied on painting not only the outside of the Falcon, but coating the inside hull black as well. In order to avoid light coming through the seams, I also had to basically seal off the gaps using modeling paste from the inside. My first application around the perimeter didn't do it, so I had to essentially make a bulkhead out of goo that separated the lit engine bay section of the interior from the rest of it. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. After that, I moved on to give the Falcon some real life. My airbrush wasn't working, and I didn't want to clean it, so I started by brush painting the Falcon with some Vallejo gray, which ended up working pretty good. Eventually, I did go over this again with some airbrushed Vallejo concrete color, which looked a lot better. And then it was on to adding the details. I looked at the supplied stickers and wondered how well they would react to the wash I had planned for this thing, and whether or not it would be worth it to hand paint all the details. I ultimately decided to use the cockpit window sticker for the flying scrap heap and paint the rest. I'm not a master at painting details like this, especially in this scale, but it was a great time and it was very relaxing. One major tip that I don't usually hear other hobby channels talk about is to simply know what position you can paint the straightest line from. This encompasses everything in the way your body is positioned, from your butt to your fingers. For me, I know I can paint the straightest line with my hand anchored on the table and the model directly to the left of my hand. This is the most stable motion I can make with my hand. This is why you'll see me rotating the model almost 360 degrees for every panel that I paint. I'm moving the work, not my hand, to keep my hand stable. Of course, if you can fully or partially rest and anchor the model on the bench as well, then you have the most stable position possible. Additionally, sitting in an unsupported upright posture can add a variable of motion to the equation as well. So I found that my personal best position is slightly reclined in this office chair that I have, with my elbows at my sides as much as possible, with the work basically in my lap. With all these considerations, I've often found that if I can simply paint a reliably straight line of about half an inch or so, then I can paint most things on models. But of course, there's always those weird corners and crevices that you just have to go for it in. Everyone's setup is different, so make sure you find your most stable painting position with yours. I used a mixture of gray paints, some gray mixed with interior yellow, and some mahogany Vallejo paint to add on the discolored panels. I looked at a few reference pictures, got the general impression, and just kind of went for it. Vallejo dark wash was used on the engine vents and the various axis panels along the upper side of the hull. And I love this wash. It is useful for so many things. I'll use it for some different weathering later. I didn't take the time to paint all of the details now because I didn't want them to be dulled by the next step. At this point, the mismatched panels look like they contrast too much, but that was done on purpose because I knew I was going to go over the whole ship with another layer. I still don't know if you call this a glaze or a wash, but it lives somewhere in between. But I'm just going to call it a glaze, and for myself, I found that this is kind of my go-to way for painting anything, especially figures. The glaze is made up of an eyeballed ratio of the base color, concrete gray, mixed with matte varnish and thinned with Vallejo thinner. To shift the color a bit, some more of that Vallejo black wash was used, along with some US field drab. So what I end up with is a glaze that is tinted darker from the black and dirtier from the field drab than the base coat, functioning as a glaze, but thin enough that it settles more into the recesses, like a wash. When applied over the mismatched panels, this has the added benefit of creating a unifying effect. If you want to try this, I cannot stress how important it is to tint the glaze correctly. Too dark and you completely shift the color. Too thin and it pulls too much and just looks like a wash. You can probably get the same job done with a simpler mix, even just water-thin paint, but this is what I've found works best for me. You can see here an A-B comparison of the result. After that was reasonably dry, it was time to finish all the little details on this space turkey. I put some more of that Vallejo black wash wherever it made sense, touching up the engine vents and access panels to add some depth. I used Vallejo gunmetal to pick out details across the hull that I guessed might make sense to be represented as bare metal, and did the same with a Vallejo brass color. The next thing I wanted to add was some rust streaks, and I broke out my trusty Vallejo rust stain and streaking set to add these. I'm still not the best at streaking acrylics, but to be fair, they're a lot harder to streak than enamels, or opening time is so stained on there forever, especially without something like a gloss varnish underneath. After some final touch-ups, I broke out the airbrush and again used that same Vallejo black wash, which flows out of the airbrush perfectly without any thinning, even at 15 psi. I made some very light streaks coming off the engine vents, building up the effect slowly. It's typically really easy for me to get carried away with this, but I think I showed some reasonable restraint in this case. My favorite part of this paint job was doing these little burn effects with the airbrush, which hopefully represent areas where the Boomer Eagle was singed by laser blasts. To accomplish this, I got really close to where I wanted them, angled the airbrush in the same vector that laser blast would have hit, and I put them wherever it made the most sense to me, mainly the protruding parts of the ship, like the satellite antenna and the cockpit tube. The final touch was adding a bit of Hobby Lobby soot-colored weathering powder to the quad cannon barrels, along with some rust-colored powder along the edges of the hull. There she is, all painted. Next, I had to get the shadow box more far, far away galaxy vibes, so I used a rattle can to prime and paint it black. The spray paint I had was labeled matte black, but it had more shine to it than C-3PO, so I knocked that back with some Tamiya flat clear, which is my go-to if I want absolutely no shine on something. I've tried several others, and none of the ones I've tried have even come close. One of the more challenging parts was getting some specks on the box in a semi-believable pattern. I had used the speckling method before when working on canvas, but I had some trouble remembering how to do it. After some trial and error, I figured out how much to thin the white and light blue paint that I used, and I just, flicked it on there using an old brush. Pretty sure that's not the correct way, but it worked. After my wife dropped by for some objective judging, I agreed that if I ever did this again, it might be fun to use some fluorescent paint for this purpose, especially in a dark shadow box like this. For the asteroids, I had a couple ideas. The first was to carve them out of XPS foam, but when I did that, they just ended up looking like concrete chunks, so I went with my second idea. Something I had never done before, crushing tinfoil into balls and coating them in plaster. This worked out reasonably well, but when painting the asteroids, I found the plaster was kind of delicate. I'd probably recommend using some type of sealer over the plaster because painting these without pieces crumbling was kind of, challenging. I used a simple combination of dark earth and a lighter brown to dry brush the high edges, also adding a few shadowy spots with some dark wash in the airbrush. Not the best asteroids in the galaxy, but they're asteroidy enough to get the point across, I think. And finally, it was all coming together. The galaxy in a box was done, and the Falcon was firmly superglued to its mount. After this, I ran the wires as neatly as I could through the back, and routed them so that they would allow the box to sit as flush as possible on the wall. A little trial and error with superglue, then some duct tape, and some final soldering, and this scale story was complete. And if you made it this far in the video, I just wanted to say thanks for watching. This is my first full build video, and I'd love to hear any feedback you might have in the comment section below. Take a second to subscribe if you'd like, and be on the lookout for the builds to keep coming and the videos to keep getting better and better.